Hi everyone, welcome to your Library at Home. My name is Rebecca, I'm part of the Public Programs team at the State Library of New South Wales. I'd like to begin this morning by acknowledging that I live and work on Gadigal land, the traditional custodians of this land, on which knowledge has been exchanged for millennia. We also celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal culture and language across New South Wales, and I take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present, and especially emerging. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining us online today. On the first Thursday of every month during the season of winter, the State Library partnered with Inspiring Australia to bring to your screens a new series, The Science of Us. This program brought together scientists, researchers, authors, and academics on topics that help us to understand troubling behaviour through the prism of science. This talk today is an extension to that program and is also a celebration of National Science Week, which commenced on the 14th of August and concludes on August 22nd, 2021. Today's talk ends the 2021 Science of Us program, and what an amazing talk to end this season on. Today we are joined by Professor Dan Loveman AN on the topic Rethinking Addiction. There will be time for questions at the conclusion of the talk, so I do encourage you to use the Q&A feature of your Zoom app at any stage to put through your questions, and we'll moderate as many of these questions as we can at the conclusion of the talk. Before we introduce Dan to your screens, I'd like to now introduce Manager of Inspiring Australia, Jackie Randalls. Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And I too would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where I'm coming to you from today, from my home in Randwick, as we're all in lockdown. Today's session on rethinking addiction is a topic that's very dear to my heart. The stigma of addiction is something that really does make it difficult for anyone facing these issues, and it's something that increasingly affects many families and Australians from all walks of life. And our guest this morning, Professor Dan Loveman, is an expert psychiatrist and addiction medicine specialist. He's the Executive Clinical Director at Turning Point, which is one of Australia's national addiction treatment, training and research centres. And you may have seen Dan on the SBS documentary series Addicted Australia. I watched that series and was struck by the empathy and kindness of Dan and all his colleagues at Turning Point as they guided participants through an out-treatment program that was really, really successful in exploring the whole range of issues people face as they try and get on top of their addictions. So Dan, I'd love to invite you to turn on your camera and say hello. We're going to hear from Dan about the science of addiction and why is it that people get hooked to all kinds of things and what the evidence base is to management. And he'll be telling us about his work at Turning Point and also as the founder of a national campaign to end the stigma, Rethink Addiction. So without further ado, I'd love to hand over to Dan now. Dan, are you with us? I can see your screen. Yes, there you are. Dan, do take it away. He'll be speaking for about 40 to 45 minutes. And as Rebecca said, please make use of the Q&A function and we'll come to your questions in 45 minutes. Okay, Dan, over to you.
Look, thanks so much for that introduction. Thanks so much for inviting me to talk to you today on this really important subject. And I'm really excited to talk about why it's time for us to rethink addiction. Can I also just start by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land which we will stand? I'm on Wurundjeri land and pay respects to elders both past, present and emerging. So just to start the talk, I think it's really important to acknowledge where we're all at the moment. For many of us, we're stuck in lockdown, so my heart really goes out to everyone who's in lockdown at the moment in New South Wales and here in Victoria and other parts of the country. And I think what we know is during lockdown, what we've seen is increasing sales related to alcohol and increasing consumption. And I suppose what we need to think about in this context where we all are of a very stressful situation and people looking to consuming more alcohol is what is an unhealthy habit? When does an unhealthy habit lead into more problematic problems? And how does that lead into addiction? And I think that's what I want to cover today, is sort of what is the science that underpins addiction, what makes people more at risk of developing addiction, and what do we know about the treatment and recovery from addiction. And I think one of the challenges we have is, if we know that people are drinking more in these times, but when we think about how we as a society think about addiction, these are generally the images that we associate with. We think about the derelict drunk, the sort of disheveled drug user, the sort of involvement of the criminal underworld, and even on our own National Ice campaign, the idea that people who use drugs either are mentally unwell or are dangerous. So these images of what we see of addiction, and for many people who are struggling and wondering whether they have a problem, these images really don't resonate with them. This is not what they feel that they can identify with. And what we have is this very strong message that addiction is often seen as a moral issue, a sign of weakness, or some sort of choice, rather than the health condition that it is. This is then perpetuated through stories that we see in mainstream media. So what we see is these cognitive bad news stories really about addiction or drug use. Is about criminality, it's about amorality, it's about deviance. We don't see any sort of positive stories about hope and recovery. It really just reinforces the stereotypes that we see that are associated with addiction, and really reinforces stigma. And as Jackie has already said, the stigma is disabling. Addiction is the most stigmatized health condition globally. Because of that stigma, many of the people who are struggling with alcohol, drug, gambling issues experience enormous shame and guilt and fear of judgment. We don't see any of those good news stories that in the media. We don't hear about those positive stories of recovery and how people are leading very positive lives. So there's an absence of hope. And because of that, it's not surprising then, because of this stigma, that what we see is enormous delay in help seeking. We have almost 20 years of delay in help seeking because people feel that they should be able to deal with this issue by themselves. They feel that it's not a legitimate health condition, and they feel very ashamed and guilty, and they bring a lot of that stigma on themselves. And one of the big problems with stigma is we get into this really sort of negative cycle. So this issue of shame, fear of getting help, isolation, disconnection, loneliness, leading to drug use, more shame, more sort of loneliness. So this sort of really negative spiral that people get into. And as the stories of Bridget and Frank really illustrate, using is not really, about pleasure. It's certainly about addressing the shame that they both feel. So I know a lot of my heavy using was because I was ashamed of what I was doing, and it didn't, common sense approach would be not to use. But in my case, it was use more so I could forget how bad I was feeling about myself. And as Frank said, I'd stuffed up so many times with things. That's why I drank as well. It wasn't to self-harm myself. It was just to, like I say, get drunk and stop thinking about what I'd done and where I went wrong. So this whole notion of shame and disconnection that many of the people that we see feel, constantly feel. So what is the reality of addiction? Well, the reality is that 1 in 5 Australians will develop a problem with alcohol, drugs, or gambling sometime in their life. So we're all in some ways touched by addiction. Somebody in our family, somebody in our community, somebody in our workplace, somebody in our social setting will be struggling with addiction. 1 in 20 people will develop addiction, and that's the more severe form of an alcohol, drug, gambling problem. And when we think about addiction, it's really important to say that addiction is a chronic health condition. It's really typified by this inability to stop consuming a drug or activity, despite it causing physical or psychological harm or affecting their life. And I think that's the biggest issue that people struggle to understand. So why is it that people continue to engage in a behavior, to take a drug, to drink, to gamble, when it's quite evident that it causes harm to the individual? It impacts on their physical and mental health, on their relationships, on their work, on their study. Why is it that people still choose to engage in that behavior. And that's something that hopefully we can start to unpack today. Before I talk about the science of addiction, I think it's really important to talk about this continuum of use, from sort of not using to social or recreational use, to a sort of using more regularly and developing unhealthy habits, to sort of chronic daily or near daily use, and then this sort of compulsive use that underpins addiction and creates a whole range of danger and harms to individuals. So what does the science tell us about drugs and drugs' impact on the brain? So really the science of looking into addiction spans the past 60 years, and what scientists have discovered is that animals, much like humans, will work hard to actually receive the same drugs that humans will use. So the animal here has a cannula in one of its veins, and it will press levers to receive a dose of a drug that we as humans also like to use. So those drugs could be alcohol, they could be drugs such as methamphetamine, cocaine, nicotine. So common drugs. The animals will also work hard, to receive those drugs. Not only that, if we put that cannula in a particular part of the brain and try and understand which parts of the brain the animal works towards receiving the drug, what we find is that if we put that cannula in a very specific part of the brain, the animals will work even harder to receive drugs directly into that part of the brain. And if we move that cannula a millimeter each way, the animal will stop responding. So there's a very important sweet spot in the brain where these drugs act that are rewarding and reinforcing and really make the animal work very hard to receive that drug. What we've discovered through decades of neuroscience research is that there's a very specific circuit which underpins this rewarding behavior. So this rewarding pathway in the brain that is called the mesolimbic dopamine system. It's a system that starts here in the midbrain, in the ventral tegmental area, produces a chemical called dopamine, which projects into the basal forebrain, to the nucleus accumbens, nucleus accumbens is very main role is in motivation and goal-directed behavior, and projects forward into frontal parts of the brain, which is important for motivating approach behavior. And what's really critical about this part of the brain is this part of the brain has evolved to underpin basically behaviors that are key to our survival. So reinforcing natural rewards. So rewards such as eating, drinking, procreating and looking after our young, key behaviors that are essential for survival, are rewarded through this system, and what also produce dopamine release in this system. What's critical about this system is that it's a learning system. So as dopamine is released, it lays connections in other parts of the brain, parts of our emotional brain, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the insula, and parts of our cerebral cortex, to sort of really implant memories around the experiences, both positive and negative, that are important for us in terms of ensuring those natural rewards are met. So it's really important that these parts of the brain are activated and learn around the types of situations, the types of signals that indicate that rewards are available and are close. And what we see is, when we look at any of the drugs that humans commonly use, including gambling behavior, what we see is that they all directly or indirectly increase dopamine in this reward pathway. And they actually, part of their power is that they're able to increase dopamine release at much greater rates than natural rewards. So that explains in some ways why these drugs and behaviors are reinforcing, and why as humans we like to engage in them. So what happens with chronic use? So when we look at people who've been using drugs chronically and have developed addiction, and we look at particularly in that part of the brain that underlies reward, this is a brain scan looking at activity of that dopamine system in that reward part of the brain. And the brighter the image is, in sense, an indication of how intact that system is. So the brighter the color, the more red the color, the more dopamine receptors are ready to receive that dopamine and to function. As we see with people with chronic use, what we've seen is major changes across different drug types in that part of the brain, so that there's not as many dopamine receptors there. While dopamine is being released by that chronic drug use, what we see is a downregulation of those dopamine receptors. So there's not as many dopamine receptors, and that reward system in some ways isn't as working as it normally would. And when we see these changes in this reward center, what we can couple that with is years of research looking at the neurochemistry underpinning reward. And normally what happens in the top picture, as you see, we go out, we go out to a party, to an event, we have a great time, that releases lots of chemicals in that rewarding part of the brain, including dopamine, and we have a great time. And the next day when we wake up, there's sort of that recovery phase, a phase B, where we might feel a bit flat, we might feel a bit exhausted. And when we look what happens when we bombard that reward system with chronic drug use, so we're constantly releasing dopamine in the system, what we see is that natural sort of A phase, that natural increase that we see, it's being changed over time. There's a change in that homeostatic set point, so that it's being recalibrated, so that as we continue to use drugs, we're not getting the same highs as we used to. In fact, it's actually getting harder to get a high, and it's actually harder just to feel normal. So we have to continue to use drugs not to get a high, but actually to feel our normal way we want to feel. And at the same time, that B process, that recovery process, is getting bigger and more prolonged. And so what we're seeing now is not only do we find it harder not only to feel natural rewards or to get a reward from drugs or gambling or drinking, what we also find is that that part of the brain, the reward system, is feeling more dysthymic, more dysphoric, more depressed, more anxious, more agitated. So our general state is more about feeling negative and depressed and agitated. And that is also a drive, to get out of that state and use drugs, even though it's not giving us the pleasure that it used to. At the same time, as I said before, this reward system, for it to be really successful, it's no good just knowing that we need water for survival. We need to know signs in the environment that predict that a water hole is near. And so this dopamine system in the reward system is also very good at identifying cues or triggers in the environment that predict the likelihood of reward. So for example, here in the panel on the left, we have an animal that's starting to learn that every time it hits the lever or receives a drug, a red light will appear. And so after time, it learns that red light predicts reward. And in fact, if we stop access to the drug, the animal will still continue to press that lever just to see the red light. So the red light in itself becomes reinforcing. And on the panel on the right, what you'll see is in our studies in humans who developed addiction, what they tell us is there's lots of cues in the environment that signal drug reward. So whether that's internal states, so feeling depressed or bored or anxious, whether that's locations, people, paraphernalia that predict the fact that they're going to get drugs. Seeing those things in the environment can make people crave, can it make people really desire drugs, and can actually lead to relapse. Similarly, when we do studies looking at the brain and looking which areas the brain light up, and by showing people images of drugs, of alcohol, of gambling, and we look in the brain using a variety of techniques, what we see is not only does that reward system light up, that nuclear accumbens light up, but areas to do with decision-making also light up. So areas that normally control our choices around short-term versus long-term rewards, making those decisions about what's more important, decisions around how we stay on track with our long-term goals, how we make sure that we don't make impulsive choices. What we see with chronic use is those parts of the brain sort of aren't working as well. So people are more likely to make impulsive choices and to preference short-term rewards over long-term rewards. So that tells us a bit about what the brain science tells us about why we like to use drugs and how that affects our brain and what happens to those part of the brains with chronic use. But it's important to say that while drugs increase dopamine, while they potently release, and activate the reward center, we know that many people use and consume drugs or gamble without ill effects. And this is data from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey 2019. Over 22,000 Australians aged 14 were asked to complete the survey. And what you can see is, if we think about drinking, about 80% of the population drink, 25% drink more than standard single occasion risk. So that's more than the recommendations of our Australian guidelines of drinking no more than 4 standard drinks on any one occasion. Similarly, 1 in 6 individuals had used illicit drug in the past 12 months. 1 in 4, 4 in 10 had used in their lifetime. And in terms of gambling, 80% of the population gamble, of which 40% are regular gamblers. So lots of people drink, use drugs and gamble, but not everyone goes on to develop addiction. And I suppose the question is what are the risks that underpin why some people are more likely to develop addiction? One of the things that helps us understand that is to look at what the motives that underlie why we might drink, use drugs or gamble. And there's 3 main sort of motives that have been identified through years of research. There's issues of social motives. So these are about using drink or drugs to sort of enhance the social interaction, to make it easier to socialize, for people feeling that it makes the social event more pleasurable. So some people use for social motives, other people use for enhancement motives. These drugs obviously affect brain chemistry, they make us feel happier, they make us feel better. So many people will describe using drink or drugs or gambling to improve our mood. The final sort of motive is around the issue of coping. So we know that many people use to sort of deal with underlying distress, underlying difficult situations. But what's interesting in work that we and others have done is that when we look at these motives and we ask people why they use, people who largely endorse coping motives predicts who's most likely to develop addiction. So if you're turning to drink or drugs or gambling to help you cope with some other issue, then you're more at risk of developing addiction. And that's interesting because if we come back to where we all are now in terms of the pandemic, this is a paper that we just published a couple of weeks ago, which we were able to look in Victoria during lockdown and look at presentations to ambulances related to alcohol intoxication. And what you can see here is there's been a big shift in terms of drinking in the home and a big shift in call outs of ambulances being called to the home for people being intoxicated and falling or injuring themselves. And what was really interesting on the panel that you see below is it shows the odds ratio or the likelihood that an ambulance is going to be called out for alcohol intoxication. And what we found was that during the early parts of lockdown, actually the rates of people calling an ambulance for alcohol intoxication actually went down. But either at the end of the lockdown or as the lockdown got more severe, so for example, stage 4 lockdown, which many of us in New South Wales and Victoria are in, what we saw is an actual increase in the likelihood of calling an ambulance for alcohol intoxication. So the harms related to alcohol actually went up. And it actually went up, while it went up across the board, it particularly went up in the age 30 to 40 year age group who are obviously struggling with financial pressures, with family pressures, with issues of homeschooling. So really indicates as we're turning to alcohol to help cope with the pandemic, many people are getting into harm's way and many people are having to call an ambulance and to be able to call an ambulance for alcohol intoxication, identifies significant harm and really speaks to a broader issue of harm in the community as we're trying to cope with lockdowns. But the important thing to say here is that while people might be using more alcohol or drugs or gambling in stressful or difficult circumstances, that doesn't necessarily translate into people having ongoing problems or that problem continuing when that initial issue sort of disappears. And this is really interesting data from the Vietnam War, because during Vietnam, it was easier often to get for soldiers to get heroin than it was to get alcohol. And the US department was really worried at the end of the Vietnam War. They knew that 1 in 5 soldiers were using heroin regularly during the Vietnam War. And they were scared that when people were coming back from Vietnam, they were going to have this huge addiction crisis in the US. and they put up a whole range of supports in place. But what was really interesting in the work of Lee Robbins is really sort of important, in this space, is when they followed people up post-Vietnam, what they found was that only between 5 and 10% of people who were using regularly heroin in Vietnam actually developed addiction when they returned to the US. So the majority of people who are using regularly in situation war, a very stressful environment, actually stopped using heroin when they returned to the US, and only around 5 to 10%, which is what we see in the general population of people who have problems with addiction, as we know in the community, continue to develop that problem. So just because we're using those drugs and coping in those situations doesn't mean that people go on and develop addiction. Similarly, if we look at a whole range of animal work that's looked at the environment and looked at the choices people make around using drugs, those initial experiments I talked to you about were very much about isolated animals in cages being given a choice between hitting a lever to access water or giving a lever to access drugs. And being social animals and being stuck in a cage and really, being in that stressful situation, it's not surprising that those animals chose to use drugs. But there's been a whole range of work now looking at what happens when we enrich the environment. And when we enrich an environment, we put an animal like around in that enriched environment, studies have shown that enriching that environment means that animals no longer preference those drug opportunities to take drugs. So having an enriched environment, decreases the risk of addiction. And similarly, taking all these things away and impoverishing that environment increases the risk of the animal having addiction. So the environment and the choices that people have in their environment is really critically important. Other really interesting pieces of work in this space look in primates. So look at primates who, like us, quickly develop a social hierarchy. And what they find is in male primates who, looking at, when we look at the differences in social hierarchy, so we look at animals that are at the top of the social hierarchy, so have the most choices in their community, versus those at the bottom of the social hierarchy, so those ones that have the least choices and opportunities in their colony. What you find is that when you give those animals access to drugs, what we find is that those males at the top of who are most dominant don't choose to use drugs or don't use to use drugs as much, but those ones at the bottom of the social hierarchy use drugs much more frequently. So again, your environment, where you sit in the world, the choices you have available, again, have been shown to increase that risk for whether you develop addiction. And when we look at the literature across the board, what we find is that there's 5 key factors that contribute to addiction. We know that family history is really important, like for other health conditions like mental illness, like breast cancer, like heart disease. We know that genetics plays an important part. And we know if you've got a strong family history of addiction, then you're also at risk of addiction. And that's why it's important to know that risk and know what steps to put in place to minimize that risk of developing addiction itself. We know that people who develop mental illness are at much higher risk of developing addiction. And, while we don't fully understand sort of the pathways to that, we know that underlying issues with stress, with emotion, emotional pain, with decision-making can all increase the risk of addiction. We also know very strongly, like I showed in the previous slide, that home and social environments are critically important. So having unstable housing, having limited opportunities in community for employment or to pursue sort of meaningful activity, feeling disconnected, feeling unsupported, having, being in some ways bullied or rejected from the people around you, all play an important role in increasing that risk for addiction. Similarly, as we just talked about COVID, stress at work, stress in the family, financial pressures, all can increase the risk of addiction. And finally, one of the, I suppose, the big things that particularly that we see in treatment is many of the people we see in treatment have an underlying history of trauma. And we know, whether it's coming back from the Vietnam War, and now we're obviously hearing about refugees from Afghanistan and also our military who served in those campaigns, We know that there's a strong correlation between trauma in war-torn areas, fighting in wars, PTSD, and the development of addiction. And we also know that childhood trauma, so trauma during childhood, victims of childhood sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, again, have a really high rates of trauma, high rates of developing and risk for developing addiction. So when we think about addiction, it's really important for us to think about addiction as so much more than using drugs. It's really about understanding what underplays that. And certainly when we talk to people and when we approach people who are struggling with addiction, I think the question is, it's less about understanding, why you take drugs, but really about what put you in this situation. So not why taking drugs, but what happened to you, I think is the question that we all need to ask. Let me just move on and just talk about treatment, because I think one of the things, the problem that we talked about before around stigma and the information we get in the mainstream media is often we don't know the fact that addiction is treatable. We often see these bad news stories and we don't actually believe that addiction is treatable. And one of the great things that we can talk about is that there's so much research, over the past 50 years demonstrating a range of different approaches, evidence-based approaches that are really important in improving outcomes in addiction, whether that be medications, psychological treatment, managing physical health, managing mental health, working with families, peer support, coping strategies, helping with housing, work and study, exercise, mindfulness, so many different ways, so many different interventions that have been shown to be effective for the treatment of addiction. And while in the popular sort of, I suppose in the public's mind, we all hear that everyone needs to go to detox and rehab. And while we know that's an important component of treatment, just really want to emphasize there's so many other ways in which people can help, so many other ways in which treatment can work. And it's really important to know that the condition is very treatable and there's lots of options available. When we also think about treatment, it's important to say, what do we need to address apart from the treatment in terms of helping people to get into recovery? And because of the shame and stigma, we know that leads to isolation, and we know that connectedness is really, really important. The evidence shows that the more connected people are, the greater opportunities there are for recovery. Similarly, shame and stigma, it has a major effect on people and people's sense of self. So providing hope and optimism is really critical. It's also critical to focus on people's identity. If all people can identify is that they feel ashamed because they identify as somebody with addiction, it's important to work with them to look at all the other positive identities they have in their life, be it a father, a mother, a sibling, a worker, the job, the roles they play, the support they play in the community. So identifying those positive identities is really critically important. It's also fair to say that many people we see are lost. They have no meaning, they've lost their way in life. And what we know that's really critical for recovery is helping people find meaning in their life, finding purpose. We know, and as we know in times of COVID at the moment, if we can't work, we can't do the things that keep us healthy, if we don't have that meaning, we all can feel terrible and it can be dispiriting. So it's really important that we help people to find that meaning in their life. And it's really important because obviously because of the stigma and discrimination associated with addiction, often people feel disempowered. So it's about how we support them to have that really positive identity, to have that meaning, to have open optimism and to be connected and to feel really positive about the opportunities that they have. I just wanted to share with you a study that we've been involved in many years ago that really reinforces this idea that addiction is treatable. So that we were fortunate enough to be able to follow up a whole range of people coming into treatment services in Victoria and Western Australia and follow them for 12 months. And what you can see here is a graph of both treatment success, so the people who dramatically reduce their substance use and improve their well-being. We can also see stats around abstinence from the PDOC or the primary drug of concern or from all the drugs they might be using. And what you can see is a really positive message. So we're seeing, rates of, above 50% on average in terms of people having treatment success, being involved in treatment, which is really, really positive. And what I think will really surprise people is that many of the drugs that we often in our mind think are terrible drugs with poor outcomes, methamphetamine, opioids, etc., we're seeing really, really positive outcomes. Where we see the poorest outcomes is around alcohol. So we actually have poorer outcomes for alcohol. And why might that be? Well, I think it's fair to say that we live in a culture where alcohol's all around, and particularly during COVID, often being seen as an essential service, often been promoted as a way of coping with the pandemic. But there's images of alcohol everywhere, and it's really embedded in our culture. And for anyone who's ever tried to stop drinking for a period of time, there's an immense amount of pressure to drink, and that drinking is part of what it means to be Australian. And so for people who are trying to stop using alcohol, being bombarded by these images, bombarded by that culture of drinking and opportunities to drink, makes it really difficult for people to stop. And that's why it's really important in the studies that we've done is identifying that peer support, so connecting with communities who don't drink or don't use, are really important in terms of helping people in their recovery journey. And so this is data from our patient pathway study that we showed before, showing that when we look at alcohol, we have just over a 30% success rate with treatment. But if people are connected to peer groups over the next 12 months, what we can see is that success rate doubles to over 60%. So connecting with peers, connecting with like-minded people who have been on that journey to provide those real, be real champions of hope and recovery, connecting and being understood and not feeling judged is incredibly important on people's journey. And so that peer support is a really crucial element that's freely available in the community, be it AA, NA, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Smart Recovery, lots of community groups that are available that can help people on that journey. The other thing that we've been able to do related to the idea that the cues in our environment sort of remind us and push us to use alcohol, drugs, or gamble again, is to think about what are the different strategies we can add to treatment to help reduce that risk of relapse, reduce our response to that autopilot of seeing those triggers in the environment and making us want to use again. And I just wanted to show you just a brief video of some work we've been doing here at Turning Point to look at treatments that identify those triggers and provide solutions for trying to retrain the brain to sort of not be hooked into those triggers, those cues we see in the environment. So let me just run this video.
Psychological research suggests that we are hardwired to push away or avoid things that we don't like, and to approach things that we do like, be that a cute puppy, chocolate cake, drugs, or alcohol. In regular drinkers, alcohol cues such as places, sights, and sounds that remind us of drinking can subconsciously capture our attention. This can drive impulses to seek alcohol, and scientists call this tendency a cognitive bias. This automatic response to alcohol cues makes it difficult to resist drinking, even when we have other things planned. Thankfully, researchers have developed an app called Swipe, which uses a form of brain training called cognitive bias modification. Swipe aims to interrupt the autopilot response to alcohol cues by training people to repeatedly push away images of alcohol and to approach healthier alternatives. Research has shown that just a few sessions can help people to reduce their drinking. Simply choose the drinks you want to stop drinking and the activities you want to start doing more, and you're ready to override your alcohol autopilot.
So again, a nice little video that talks about that cognitive bias that we have towards those triggers in the environment. And, I really want to say a big thanks to Victoria Manning here at Turning Point and her team who've developed and worked on that brain science to develop a mechanism to help people have another tool in their armory to sort of stop responding to those cues in the environment. And we've shown in a recent trial in our detox here that having 4 sessions of the cognitive bias modification, so that type of swipe intervention, can dramatically reduce the risk of relapse. So a really important addition to the armory of tools we have in terms of the treatment of addiction. Let me now turn back to where we started, which is around talking about stigma and what we can do about reducing the stigma, because we know stigma is a huge barrier to help seeking, even though we know that treatment works. And so it's important to look at what's happened in other anti-stigma campaigns to understand what we need to do in this space. And when we look across a whole range of different campaigns, whether it be in the treatment, reducing stigma around mental health, HIV, depression, what we see is that the most important thing we can do is really share sort of humanizing narratives, sort of talk about social inclusion, show that people aren't just, that image of somebody with addiction, but are an essential member of the community. So for example, here in the US campaign, Let's Stop HIV Together, it's about, talking about people more than just the fact that they're HIV. I'm a devoted son, a singer, an artist, and I'm living with HIV. So it's presenting those positive images of what people can contribute and are contributing to the community. Similarly, in the HIV space, there's really strong evidence that when the community began to understand that HIV treatment works, the community attitude went from thinking that HIV is a punishment and people deserve HIV to people now believing that it's an illness that can be treated. So understanding that something is treated not only changes the community mindset and changes that sort of perception and stigma, but also what we know promotes help seeking and encourages people to speak out and reach out for support. And we know that telling those stories not only are really important for changing those community narratives, but also very important because when people are able to tell their own story, it helps reduce their own stigma. So it's really important that we create opportunities to tell stories and challenging the prevailing misconceptions and stereotypes that we have. And that brings us on to a documentary that we were really fortunate to be part of last year, Addicted Australia, which hopefully many of you have seen. It's still on SBS On Demand if you haven't seen it. But we worked with Blackfella Films, a highly acclaimed production company, and SBS, to put together a treatment program, support 10 courageous Australians in their quest to address their addiction. And we basically pulled together an outpatient program that drew on many of the treatment elements I talked about before: medical treatment, psychological treatment, peer support, family support, providing that continuity of care, providing access to detox where they needed it, and other social supports, and really followed their lives. And really the show was really about telling the true story of addiction, talking about the real people that we see every day. And for anyone who's seen the show, it's an incredible documentary that really sort of busts many of the myths and misconceptions around addiction and shows the real people who are struggling, who are many like, who for many of us are like people who are in our workplace or in our community. We see their struggles, we see what the reality of addiction is, and we see the hard work and effort that people put in to try and get it better. So a really important, compassionate take of addiction that I encourage everyone to watch. On the back of that campaign, which is very much about elevating those real stories of addiction and providing, those opportunities about hope and recovery, we launched the Rethink Addiction campaign. And the Rethink Addiction campaign is really a national campaign dedicated to educating and advocating for the need to change Australia's attitude and approach to addiction. We're blown away by the support we've had to date, with over 40 organisations across civil society, the AMA, the Royal Colleges, the nurses, health organisations, health unions, Families Australia, universities, all coming on board. Now over 50 organisations on board. And it's really about elevating the issue of addiction, particularly in this era of COVID, that there's so many Australians struggling. We need to establish it as a national priority. We need to think about a national plan and roadmap. We need to really invest resources in developing better ways for people to get help. And part of that website, part of the campaign is about sharing stories. And if you go on the website, you'll see a whole range of stories that people have submitted. And it really encourages many people as possible to share your story, to really tell that real story and really debunk what we see in those mainstream press. So if people want to get involved in this campaign, I really urge you to. There's many ways you can get involved. You can visit the campaign website, you can sign our petition, you can update your email signature, wear one of our Rethink Addiction badges, share your story as I've talked about on the website, watch the show on SBS On Demand and tell as many people as you can about the campaign and the TV series. So really keen to think about how we can amplify people's voices and tell those really real stories of addiction and really change the narrative we currently have about addiction in Australia. On that note, I'm going to stop. And before I stop, I just want to reiterate that help is available. There's free and confidential support available 24/7 across Australia. Whether it's alcohol and drug support, there's an alcohol and drug support helpline, 1-800-250-115, available, put you through to your local services in your local state, and also counselling online, which is an online counselling service available 24/7 that offers web chat, SMS support, self-assessment, self-help resources, an online forum that people can connect with and share their stories, and a whole range of change strategies. And certainly in the gambling space, the National Gambling Helpline, 1-800-858-858. And the important national helpline, gamblinghelpline.org.au. So many ways to get help. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you so much, Dan. What an informative and wide-ranging presentation with so much information about the science and what's actually going on in our brains. And it's really, the more I think about these issues, the more I realize that it really is a physical health condition. It's got very little to do with willpower. And I wondered if you could talk to us about willpower, because quite often people think that, people are just not being strong enough, or they could change if only they wanted to, but they don't want to change. What could you say about that?
Thanks, Jackie. I think that's what we thought about depression 10 years ago or more. And we used to think about the fact that depression was just people who were a bit sort of mentally weak. They couldn't deal with the sort of normal stresses of life. And we didn't used to talk about depression, and we didn't talk about mental health because we sort of blamed individuals and said that somehow they were it was their fault. And I think when we talk about that issue of willpower, I think that's a very simplistic idea, isn't it? And, certainly working with people every day with addiction across a whole range of addictions. And when you hear their life stories and you hear what's happened to them, like I talk about in the talk, what's actually happened to them, it's not really a choice. It's the fact that things have happened that put them on this journey. And unfortunately, they haven't had the support or skills to be able to deal with those issues. And so I think willpower is a red herring that sort of just allows us and feeds into that stigma narrative and allows us to blame people. And I think for any of us who come across anyone in any walk of life who are struggling, the important thing is to ask the questions around how they got there and to take a very compassionate lens to thinking about why people are struggling and what we can do to support them.
And that's what I loved so much about your SBS TV series, that unconditional love and support that some of the characters had from their family members, who really just put their judgment at the door and were with them and could totally empathise on how hard this was for them, even when they relapsed.
I think that's exactly right. And as Sarah says, one of the participants in the documentary on the series, one of the things she says in the peer group, which I think really echoes everyone's sentiments, is how hard she works every day on her recovery. She works a lot harder than many other people work on themselves. And yet, she feels that blame and stigma from the community that somehow, because she's got an addiction, that she's not deserving, that she shouldn't be supported. And it's really interesting because Australia is a place that does barrack behind people who, are struggling. It is about supporting those people who are struggling. But yet, when it comes to addiction, rather than support the people who really need our help, we're quick to blame and judge. And I think that's what the Rethink Addiction campaign's about. It's about telling those really stories and really encouraging people to get behind people and support them to get the help and support that they need.
So even though we know that there's help available, is it only shame and stigma that stops people from reaching out and accessing that support? What are some of the other things that might make it hard for someone to actually take that step?
Yeah, well, I think, look, obviously shame and stigma are really important because, you know, if you're feeling blamed, you're feeling judged for the choices you make, even though they might not be, you might be driven to those choices because of what's happened to you. It's very hard to reach out for help because, you know, what we see by the time we see people coming for treatment, you know, everyone has told them that they just stop and they feel incredibly upset that they can't stop themselves. So there's shame and judgment involved. But one of the things we know is that many people feel that they should be able to sort, you know, this whole idea of willpower, many people feel that they should be able to deal with the problem by themselves. So they don't feel that they're deserving of treatment or that treatment is available. We also don't have messages, as I say in my presentation, there's no messages out there of there is help available like we do for mental health, like we do for a whole range of other health disorders. So there's not much public information out there that addiction is treatable and help is available. And I know when I first started in medicine, and I used to see people present with cancer many, many years ago, and I used to see people present with really end-stage cancer. They've had it for a long time, they knew they had it for a long time, but because they felt that cancer was a death sentence and they didn't feel, and often there was a lot of stigma around cancer in those days, we saw people presenting much later. So what we know, what's happened in depression and cancer has changed. We know that if we address, we have these more positive messages, we get the message out that addiction is treatable, we provide structures and supports that make it easier for people to get help. So we equip our health workforce to really help people get the help when they need it. We can make a dramatic change in this country.
A friend of mine said to me once, she discussed her alcohol consumption with her doctor, who said to her, why don't you just have a mocktail? And it kind of closed the conversation, as if she had someone in deep addiction had a choice that she could just switch to a mocktail. And that kind of closed it down, and that was the end of the conversation. So I think what you're advocating for to change the conversation is really important, and we all need to do it at every level.
I think that whole issue of that simple thing of just stop, like what a simple solution that obviously nobody's thought about before. And I think it's not that message of, you know, why don't you stop? It's about why can't you stop? And trying to understand what's going on beneath the surface that makes it so difficult for people to reach out for support and know and get the skills and support they need to sort of address what's happening underneath the surface.
Yeah. So we've got lots of questions here, and someone's asked, what's the ideal scenario for family members to start the process of supporting someone with an addiction? What would that look like?
Well, I think, you know, that's really, I mean, families play a critical role, and obviously families are often the first to identify when there's an issue. And I think the most important thing I can say here is that, you know, families shouldn't be trying to do this alone themselves. There's lots of supports, there's lots of information out there, there's lots of support networks and peer networks out there that support families. So I'd really encourage families to get the information they need, to reach out either on the helplines that I've just, you know, the online and the telephone helplines. You know, 20 to 30% of people who call our helplines are family members. So I'd ask them to reach out and get advice about the best way to approach people to get support, but also to make sure that they've got the right support in place, you know, so that they feel that they've got the strength to actually support somebody else. So get the information, get the support, there's lots out there, but families play that critical role. And, you know, as you mentioned in the documentary, you know, it's the power of families, the compassion of families, the support of families that really help people on that journey of recovery.
There's quite a few questions about other forms of addiction, food, pornography, gaming, and so on. How does this conversation about addiction relate to all of those substances and behaviours that might become addictive?
Look, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think what we've learned over the past 50 years is that many of the newer addictions that we're seeing sort of have overlaps in terms of brain science. with the traditional addictions, with the alcohol and drugs and gambling that we've seen. It affects the same brain systems. But again, I think what we need to think about here is when we think about addiction, we often have to understand, well, what is driving that? And one of the things about drugs, alcohol, gambling, and even food and internet and pornography, they often allow people to escape pain, and many of the drugs we're talking about are essentially emotional analgesics. They switch off the pain that many people feel, the emotional pain that many people feel. So if people are choosing to distract themselves with alcohol, drugs, gambling, food, porn, etc., that they're trying to escape the terrible emotional pain they're feeling. And I suppose part of what we do in treatment is not only help them to think about strategies to help reduce the behavior that's causing them problems, but also trying to get to the heart of that emotional pain. What is causing that emotional pain? How do we give people other strategies, other approaches to deal with that emotional pain so they're not reliant on those other behaviors that are causing them so much harm?
And so do we have as much data about those non-substance addictions that you've just mentioned as we do to alcohol and drug use? Is there the same amount of research?
Well, I think not as much. So many of our national surveys, for example, here in Australia and elsewhere, constantly look at alcohol and drugs and also gambling. But many of those other issues that people have raised, no, they're not really included in current national surveys. There's certainly increasing research in that area. I mean, the more, I suppose, if we're saying that people are trying to escape emotional pain, I think anything that any new behavior that comes along, anything that allows us to escape. I mean, I think, we can talk about mobile phones and the internet and social media and shopping, I mean, things that innately give us pleasure, they're designed to sort of give us that sense of purpose and pleasure, but essentially distract us from real life, from the pain of real life. We're getting more and more information on those. But the good news is the approaches to those addictions are very similar to the traditional addictions. So it's about giving people strategies to be able to reduce that type of behavior and addressing the underlying emotional pain and providing strategies to deal with that.
So the person who asks for data on food addiction could find some information potentially on your website in her
Not
search.
necessarily about food addiction, but certainly if people want to contact us, we can certainly direct them to what we're knowing about a range of different research groups are looking at all these different addictions.
Another question asks, what can we do when the person knows they have a problem, but they won't do anything about it? They're aware of it, everybody knows, but they just don't want to do anything.
That's a great question, Jackie. I mean, I think that's the question that relates to all of us. I mean, we all know things about ourselves that we should be doing or would like to do, whether it's about our health, whether it's about our diet, whether it's about exercising, whether it's about not being so engaged in work, whether it's about spending more time doing other stuff. So all of us struggle constantly with things that we know we should be doing, but choose to do different things. And the issue here is not focusing around, the person themselves knows themselves that they need to change. And everyone we see who comes through our services wants to change. The issue is that they haven't been able to do that or struggle to do that. So the issue here is about understanding why. What are the barriers to actually getting better? So it's not that we haven't met a single person come to treatment who doesn't want to change. The issue is that they've either tried and failed, or they don't understand what's driving them and why they keep doing this, even though that it's causing such an impact. So the key thing that is to encourage people to get help, to try and understand what are the barriers to sort of, changing that behavior, what underpins that. Too much of the time, people are blaming themselves. They feel it's because, there's something wrong with them, that they're somehow, a terrible person, and feeling guilty and ashamed. We've got to help people to understand what is driving that behavior and understand what are the many different approaches that we do have that can help them overcome that and actually get them to be where they want to be.
So look, there are so many questions and we won't have time to get to them all, but I would encourage everybody to go to the Turning Point website and have a look, where Dan is the executive director, and also have a look at the Rethink Addiction campaign and join this conversation, because I think the more we talk about it, the better it's going to be for everyone, not just ourselves, but our family members and our whole community. And Dan, I just thought in this time of lockdown, if we could speak very briefly about online help that people can get. You showed us the Swipe, was it Swipe? The app that you explained. What do you think of these online apps and services that people can connect with?
Look, I think we're very fortunate here. There's lots of brilliant services across Australia. So as I said, counselling online, nationally available websites that have a whole range of different resources, information, ability to chat to a counsellor, to join a group, really legitimate websites that I encourage people to go and explore and look at. Lots of opportunities to talk in that peer community and get advice around what apps, what's available that can help people. There's some really great resources out there. I think it's about just making that first step to reach out for help and to talk to other people who've either experienced, the same things that you've been going through, or somebody has been going through. Lots of really great resources out there. Just encourage people to not, the big thing, as I said at the beginning, both for individuals and family, the shame and stigma means that people are scared to reach out for help. Lots of really great websites out there. Please reach out, ask for support. Lots of great resources, lots of help available.
Well, look, thank you so much, Dan, for your wonderful presentation today. We have recorded it and the State Library will be publishing it in due course, so look out for it, everybody. And Dan, all the best with your work at Turning Point, and I really look forward to seeing where the Rethink Addiction campaign goes. And it's been great to have you as part of National Science Week and looking at the science of us. And I'd just like to thank Rebecca too for hosting this series with the State Library of New South Wales. So before we finish up, I'll just hand back to Rebecca. And thank you so much, Dan, and thanks to all of you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Thank you, Dan. It was a fascinating discussion. It really was. Great questions coming through. And it was such a great way to end this program, which has been just a little mini series through winter. So thank you, Jackie and Inspiring Australia, for your participation and help with all of that. All of the Science of Us program will be recorded, transcribed and added to the State Library website and also the State Library's YouTube channel. So I do encourage you all to view that. We should hopefully have all of those talks up by the middle of September. I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to join us online this afternoon. The State Library have plenty of talks happening online, not just for National Science Week, but ongoing through lockdown. So I encourage you all to have a look at the website, also for other resources and stories and content that is added daily. I just wanted to, before we end, wish everybody at home well, whether you're in Victoria, New South Wales, regional, or even internationally. We are going through a very difficult time. So I encourage you all to keep safe and keep well. And thank you so much, Dan and Jackie. And I hope to see you all online again for upcoming events. And when we open, I hope to see as many of you back in the library as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Dan.